Oops. Oh no. I forgot to bring my camera down. There we go. Was up in the air. Okay. Let me just switch it around. This is very disturbing today, isn't it? Hang on, I'm going to switch myself around. Oh, yeah. Flip over. All right. Okay. Thanks for joining. I see there's a few people here. That's cool. All right. So we're going to get straight into it. So this is the first episode of Hedge History. So this is the show where every week, every Thursday at least, we'll dig into or dig up the practices and the people. Not literally dig the people up. We're not going to do any particular necromancy. But dig everything up that the popular version or the modern version of witchcraft history tends to kind of skip over. With our TikTok and everything else, I think things are getting a bit blurred and lost in the fray. So today I'm going to talk about a group that I think gets completely misunderstood whenever kind of like show up in like a Halloween article or a low budget documentary, and that's the cunning folk. So if you've heard the term at all, you've probably heard it used almost interchangeably with the word witch. And I want to spend some time today actually convincing you that that's wrong and that the distinction actually matters, both historically and culturally. And then I want to introduce you to one very specific cunning man working or did work in Essex in the 1800s, who became so famous that people still tell stories about him flying around the air. And his name was James Murrell, and they called him the Cunning Man of Hadleigh. All right. So, to start with though, cunning folk. This is a term historians, as well as the people of the time, and also now, a lot of people still call themselves cunning folk. This was used for a class of village magical practitioners who were active in Britain from roughly the 1500s all the way into the 20th century and now in modern times. All right. So the word cunning here doesn't mean sly or deceptive the way we'd use it today. It's an older sense of the word, closer to something like knowing or wise, and it's often associated with an old word which is kenning. Now, a cunning man or cunning woman was literally someone who knew things, specifically someone who knew how to fix problems that ordinary medicine, ordinary law, and ordinary religion couldn't touch. All right. And there are there were a lot of those problems in those days anyway. Like if your cow stopped giving milk, or if your butter wouldn't churn, if your piece of jewelry went missing, if you fell ill in a way the local doctor couldn't explain, or if you suspected your neighbor had cursed you. These were everyday crises for ordinary people, and the cunning folk were who you went to. All right, they were, in the very real sense, a service industry. You paid them, often a small fee, sometimes in goods, and they performed a function. Now you might be thinking, but this is the witch of the forest. Bear with me, we're going to get there just now. So there's a historian called or named Owen Davies, or goes by the name Owen Davies because his name is Owen Davies. He describes the cunning folk as offering an enormous range of services, finding lost objects and stolen goods, locating buried or hidden treasures, fortune telling, love magic, healing the sick, protecting livestock, and this is the big one we'll come back to as well, undoing the effects of witchcraft. All right. That word service is important because it tells you something about how cunning folk operated. They weren't hidden in secretive cult figures meeting at midnight. Many of them advertised and ran shops. People traveled considerable distances on foot 4 hours probably, specifically to consult a well-regarded cunning man or woman. And this was a known, named, locatable trade. The same way a blacksmith or a midwife was likewise a known, named, locatable trade. All right, grab some coffee. Make sure you got your brew with you. It's not brew or babble, but still we're gonna have a coffee or something to drink along the way. All right. So in the early modern English imagination, a witch was someone believed to cause harm through supernatural means, what the legal language of the time called maleficium. All right, a witch killed their livestock, or killed your livestock, sickened your children, soured your milk, or worked in league with the devil to do damage to your community. Witchcraft accusations were about harm. They were prosecuted as a crime. Between the 1500s and the early 1700s, thousands of people in Britain, overwhelmingly women, often poor, often elderly, often simply unpopular with a neighbor, really, were investigated, tried, and in a significant number of cases, executed on the belief that they were responsible for misfortune in their community. Now, a cunning man or cunning woman did the opposite job. Their entire professional reputation rested on being the person you went to when you suspected a witch targeted you. Owen Davies puts this really clearly. Cunning folk were unbewitchers. Okay, their trade was identifying when someone had been cursed and then reversing it through charms, through rituals, through prayers, through herbal remedies, sometimes more elaborate counter magic like the witch bottles we'll get to in a minute. I think I included it here, otherwise I'll do an episode about the witch bottles anyway. So functionally, cunning folk and accused witches sat on opposite ends of the same belief system. One was feared as the source of supernatural harm, the other was hired specifically to combat that harm. And that distinction wasn't just a folk level nuance, it shaped how the authorities actually treated them. England's witchcraft statutes targeted maleficent magic, harmful magic, and cunning folk, because their public function was protective and restorative rather than harmful, occupied a much grayer, more sort of tolerated legal space. Thanks for the sweet psych. They were sometimes harassed, sometimes prosecuted for fraud, occasionally swept up in suspicion themselves, but as a class, they survived and operated quite openly for centuries, including during periods under monarchs like Elizabeth I and James I, when the legal climate around witchcraft accusations was at its most severe. And that's worth paying more attention to because in the very era when a frightened community might drag a suspected witch in front of a magistrate, that same community might walk to the next village over to pay a cunning woman to break the curse the witch had supposedly cast. So fear of witches and reliance on cunning folk weren't contradictory, they were two sides of the exact same worldview. And I think this is the single most important thing to take away if you only remember one fact from this entire episode. Cunning folk were not an underground or persecuted countercultural tradition in the way modern witchcraft sometimes is. They were closer to community-sanctioned tradespeople, operating in a magical economy that most people at every social level took completely seriously. Now, in practice, a cunning person's toolkit usually blended several traditions at once, which is itself an interesting historical point because it shows these weren't isolated folk superstitions operating in a vacuum. Cunning folk regularly drew on things like written charms and conjurations. Many lifted or adapted from older ecclesiastical and even academic magical texts, such as grimoires that have circulated in various forms since the medieval period. But also astrology, used for everything from diagnosing illness to picking favorite timing or favorable timing for an action to locating lost property based on the position of the stars at the time it went missing. Again, herbal medicine, which often overlapped heavily with what a local healer or midwife might know, blurring the line between magical practitioner and folk doctor. And then divination. They used scrying, sometimes using mirrors or bowls of water to answer questions or identify a thief, for instance. And also physical counter magic, where you know objects made or enchanted to trap, reflect, or burn out a curse. And that blending actually matters. Um, Cunning folk weren't practicing one single tradition the way we might imagine a tidy modern lineage. They were drawing eclectically or syncretically on Christian prayer, in academic ceremonial magic that had trickled down from educated and clerical sources, on classical astrology, and on regional herbal knowledge, and stitching it together into a practical, results-oriented service. And if something worked or was believed to work, it stayed in the toolkit. Now, just grab a bit of brew here. Hold on. All right. Now, let's turn to a real person who was cunning folk, and there's no in the historical records than James Murrell. And Murrell was born around 1785 in Rockford in Essex, England. Um, Hold on, I think I've frozen. Just wait until everything comes back in order. Oh, my camera just. Hold on a second. Let me see what's going on. If my computer will come back to normal. Please hold for technical difficulties during the Mercury retrograde.